Hello, my name is Maddie Corum, and I'll be interviewing Claudia McDonald. Um, Claudia is my grandmother. Claudia, would you mind sharing some basic background information about yourself? For example, your full name, birthplace, and date, parents, siblings, etc.
Sure, I'd be happy to in support of your educational efforts. I was born on January the 28th in 1940 in Hill County, which is in central Texas, a small farming community called Penelope. Had been named after some railroad engineers' children, actually. My parents were Albert and Sophie Kohler. They are second generation from the Czech country. I have two younger sisters. I'm married to Jim McDonald. We married on 10/13/62. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in Home Economics from Texas Women's University. Did additional graduate work at Texas A&M University. I'm retired. I worked for the Texas Agricultural Extension Service for almost 40 years, primarily with the 4-H and youth part of the program, and it was a wonderful career, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Politically, I'm an independent.
All right, thank you, Claudia. To start off with the questions, what were some of the first signs you noticed in your childhood or teenage years of sexism or unfairness towards women?
I grew up in a working class, hardworking class of people, and I did not see at an early age a lot of sexism toward women. That became evident to me actually as I, sometime in the late 50s or 60s after I left to college. Early on, my mother and her sisters and aunts and other women that I knew were very much involved in all of the operation of the farming community. It was a team effort for our family, for both parents, and actually as children reached the age of being able to make contributions, we did that too. I do remember that my grandmother's medical doctor was a woman. I definitely remember that. And for a woman doctor, and Dr. Hazel Montgomery from West Texas, in the 1940s, did not seem unusual to me because she was just always there when our grandmother needed something. They called Dr. Montgomery and she made house visits. So I guess in looking back, there were not that many female doctors at that time, but that was one of my early recollections that I think about and remember.
That's interesting. Do you remember noticing any other kinds of unfairness or social injustice in your community? For example, something like racism or discrimination against religion?
Our community was very evenly divided between white Protestants and Czech Catholics. And it was very equal in my own graduating class, which was small. For example, there were 9 Catholic Czech kids and 9 and Protestant white kids. And it wasn't always that way, but it was pretty representative. There was a small community of black families that lived in our community. I wasn't too aware of it at the time until later when I moved away, but in the 40s I wasn't aware of it. I was aware that the black community had a separate school, but it only went from about first through, I think, maybe 6th grade. There was no black high school in our community. So while the white students were provided with an educational opportunity, and most of them achieved it, went through the 12th grade. So we had a ladder that gave us some direction, I guess I would say, that we strived and we were pushed and prodded to keep studying, working. Education was very important to everybody in our community. My father served on the school board, and we knew how important it was to keep our attendance in these little rural schools up. So you were in school every day, and so there was a lot of discipline to get that done. The community supported all of those efforts. I do know, in looking back, we had men and women teachers, but the principal was always a man. The members of the school board were all white men. The members of the leadership groups at the church were almost always, I guess the men and women's groups at church were separate. The men were more concerned with finance, and the women were concerned with altar cloths and flowers and the beauty of the surroundings.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that. Did you notice any cases where, like in your community, for example, you mentioned earlier the sort of stepladder that you and a bunch of the white students at your high school had to get from the beginning of their education towards like high school and college? Did you notice any for example, did the black students have the same opportunities as you did, or did they have less of a chance to sort of climb this stepladder, as you called it?
I know now that the ladder for the black students, I guess I would say it was shaky and small and not very long. It only went through about the 6th grade, and that was as far as they could go. I think that sometimes they got books that we could no longer, that were outdated or we didn't use in our school. The idea was, well, we'll send these over to, and I think it was called at that time the colored school. I believe that was the terminology that was used. And you know, some of the other, which in today's world we think of being very derogatory words, were common language in the 40s. It was used by everyone. So language has made a difference, and that's been a change I've seen.
That's interesting. I didn't know that language was that big of a difference when you were a child. So what is your personal opinion on like how the black students were given less of an opportunity, or how, I don't know, females were given less of an opportunity in, per se, college? Has your opinion changed since you were younger to now that you're older and can look back on those experiences?
I don't think my opinion has changed. My understanding has changed, which I guess would be reflected in my current opinion is different, but maybe I'm not saying that right. The question again was to say, help me to understand.
Oh, your opinion on like the way like now that you're looking back and kind of understanding the way the people were discriminated against, do you like, what's your opinion on that? Do you think it was normal, or do you dislike it or disagree with it? Sort of express
At the time, it was very normal, and so that's the way it was in the 40s and 50s in our community. It was a very normal thing, and you would have to remember too, as I reflect back, that at that time our world was small. We had my family subscribed to the daily newspaper, so we always read the Waco News Tribune. There were some magazines that came into our home, but those did not so much deal with political kind of issues. But the newspapers did, and radio was important. We got our first television, I do remember, in 1953 when I was 13. But, of course, television news was not then what it is now by any means, but that, did broaden our horizon and broadened our world, because then we could get news in the location where we were. We got television news from Dallas and Fort Worth and Waco and Temple, so we were in an ideal location to probably get more television early news than many areas in Texas, in many rural areas in Texas received. And so it provided us with news, with entertainment. Neighbors came over to watch because we had one of the first televisions, and there were crazy things. As I look back now, there was wrestling on Monday night and Lawrence Welk on Saturday night, and
so on these new opportunities, such as the television and the newspaper that you got from different cities around you, despite the fact that you weren't able to see a lot of the outside world, I guess, the rest of the United States, do you remember any propaganda, like, for example, books or movies or speeches or certain articles in the newspaper that were against, either in an indirect or direct way, certain races or women?
At an early age, no, I do not remember. Again, because it was just a very much accepted as a part of who we were and where we were at that time. I guess, again, in looking back, there were the little theater groups did minstrels, in which they painted themselves with black faces and did jigs and made dances and did silly things, making fun of black comedians. And that ceased after there was much focus on integration, when the language changed, when the way we talked about other people.
That's pretty cool. That's kind of sad that people actually did plays against them, but yeah. Were there any specific people, or like there was groups in the civil rights movement who spoke out against racism and discrimination against black people? Do you remember noticing any of those groups in your community as you grew older, or like around you in your social circles?
No, we did not have that kind of activity in our community. In Central Texas, no.
Do you remember reading about it in, say, the newspaper, or hearing it on TV?
On television, yes, but again, that was later. That was into the 60s.
How did your family react to the television like news broadcasts and things that they heard, as you said, in the 60s and 70s?
I think they were, my parents, for example, were afraid because it was something they didn't understand. There was a little bit of fear there, because while it never happened in our community, there were, these stories that would come through of mobs or lynchings. But again, that was kind of in the far, far away land somewhere. Yeah, it happened, but not to anyone that I knew, not in my community. But we were sort of aware of it.
So, by saying you were aware of it, did your parents, as you grew older and like went to college and high school, did your parents like specifically choose certain schools or think about your education choices based on based on racism in the schools that you were available to, and also were any of the schools you not accepting certain people?
Well, that was true, and again, you know, my boundaries for going to school were Texas. I didn't have a vision to go any further than that at that point. So I did have cousins and knew some people who had gone to Texas A&M, and you know, with the magic of the Aggies down there. In today's world, or if I had made that decision later, I probably would have considered Texas A&M University. But I graduated from high school in 1957, and girls and women were not eligible to enroll at Texas A&M. It was an all-male school. Everybody had to be in the Corps at that time, and no women were allowed. It just didn't happen. And I made no effort to apply or to file a suit or complain about it. I just didn't. It was just, no, you can't go. It was like, okay, where can we go? And because I knew that my goal was to major in home economics or library science. That was what I was going to do. And so 2 schools that were available to me within reason, economically and distance-wise. Texas Woman's University in Denton was my choice, and that's where I spent my college years. And
Thank you for that, Claudia. I apologize for cutting you off there. So you talked about how you got a great career out of the opportunity of college. Once you had gotten a new job, or when you were applying for new jobs, were there certain opportunities that were restricted to women or colored people?
yes, there were. We were, because I was applying for a job with the Agricultural Extension Service of Texas A&M University. They were basically hiring 2 different kinds of people, and the agricultural agents were always men. The home economics agents were, at that point, always women. So, growing up in an agricultural background, I think I could have been trained and could have done a good job as a county agricultural agent, but because that was not an option to me, I became a home economics agent.
So
And at that time, all of the white agents were part of the Texas A&M at College Station. There was another black extension office at Prairie View A&M, which was in Prairie View.
So there was separate offices for black people and white people?
Yes, and separate offices for ag men and home economics women.
That's, wow. So you guys are pretty separated.
Mm-hmm. And salaries were not equal.
The women were paid less?
Yes.
And the black people, were they paid around the same as the women, or even less than that?
I don't know the exact figures, but my estimation would be that it was probably less. But the black extension agents that I later got to know really well were very well trained by Prairie View and their universities. They were excellent professional people in their communities.
Once you got this job, for example, was your boss, did your boss favorite either certain people in your in your positions and in your workplace, because of either their race or because of their gender?
Well, there was sort of a dual line of women supervised home economics women up and down the line. That was in the 60s. Into the 70s, that began to change.
So the favoritism thing sort of like subsided, I guess, by the time it was into the 1970s.
It was melting away, I guess I would say, yeah.
And after you were a county extension agent, did you have a different job where it was more prominent or even less prominent?
It stayed about the same. I began to I later had ag co-workers who were female maybe into the 80s. There were more women then went into fields of agriculture after Texas A&M became co-ed, and Texas Tech started graduating more ag majors. So that happened.
So you talk about how women were kind of doing a little bit better by the time it got to the 1970s. Do you remember the publication of Miss Magazine, this sort of feminist magazine thing that supported women, coming out when you were like an adult?
I do not remember the magazine. No, I don't. One of the big changes that did happen to women during that time created a lot of chatter, was that all of a sudden, somewhere along there, we were allowed to wear pantsuits to work. Because prior to that time, a professional dress was very important, and that was a dress, no pants. So I don't know exactly what year that happened. Probably somewhere in the late 60s, I could just guess. I remember getting this official letter from our director with instructions about what we could wear.
Okay. It's 8 o'clock.
So you say that you're like you were allowed a big deal was when women were allowed to wear pantsuits and didn't only have to wear skirts in your workplace. Did you have a lot of friends who worked with you who disliked the rule or wanted to stand up against it or tried to stand up against it?
Oh no, we all jumped on it. Everybody got all these pantsuits. We loved it. But we didn't. I don't think we ever marched for it or wrote letters about it. We were not a rebellious community or a group, I guess by their nature, home economics people are just pretty...
passive?
Yeah, passive in the sense that are easily led, or I don't know. We just knew what our job was and we were doing it. We weren't going to let other people solve those other issues. That was not something that we saw actually as a detriment to what we were doing. It didn't matter if we were building gardens or painting houses or making dresses. It didn't matter what we had on as long as we were developing communities and teaching boys and girls and strengthening families through the programs that we were involved in.
So even though you had some limited opportunities and you weren't allowed to work in the agricultural business, you and the other women who worked with you were sort of happy in the positions you had?
Very happy.
That's good to hear.
Because we knew that we were contributing to the economic and raising the standards of living for Texas families, and that was our mission.
I'm glad to hear that. Were there any black people who were unhappy with the conditions and having to be separated from you? And as you progressed further into the 1970s and beyond, did you befriend or notice any of your black colleagues able to have better opportunities and work with you, or did they stay the same? Or
when the two services were merged, I thought even at that time that it was very unfair, because the black agents who had had a lot of status in their communities all of a sudden had to answer to a white supervisor. None of them were made district directors or supervisors, and that was very wrong. So in a sense, it was a little bit of a demotion for them.
So when they were separated, they actually had more.
They
black people had more.
They had their own district directors and a state director, and their supervisors were all in a line of supervision, blacks that were tied to Prairie View A&M. Then when they became apart, when the agencies merged, their supervisors were given some kind of, but it was kind of an in-name-only job. All of a sudden the black agents became, or their evaluations were conducted by white district directors. And that's really what happened. And then as promotions or as vacancies became available, they were not always
eager
to
jump to them.
Well, they were not always considered, or they were offered some kind of excuses why they couldn't do it or shouldn't do it. There was a case, I can't quote all of the legality of it, but there was a black agent named Poole, Poole, who did file a discrimination suit, and it did make some difference that took time. But that was the only legal thing that I was not personally involved in, but I knew that it was something my agency was a part of. And after that, then we had to have formal written job descriptions, and then there became a very formal kind, and this was, I think, as a part of a court decree, formal application process, and openings had to be announced to everybody. Prior to that time, the district directors would just pick whoever they wanted to and do it.
That's wow. Okay. Did you stay in this county agent position long enough for there to be changes, and what exactly brought on those changes? Do you remember hearing in the news about, for example, marches that MLK did and things that the president, LBJ, and the ones after him talked about?
I think Texas was on the fringe of a lot of that. A lot of the focus of the media. It certainly occurred in Texas. I mean, the discrepancies and the violations. But the media reports were not so much in Texas. Or they didn't come into my living room every night that I was aware of. It wasn't something we spent much time worrying about or talking about. We were aware of the problems that were in the Deep South, certainly in Mississippi and Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, in Arkansas, where the high school was integrated, Central High in Arkansas. I do remember that.
So you talked about earlier how the two offices, the section of black offices and the section of white offices, were combined or joined.
Merged,
yeah. What exactly brought on that change? Was there like a law passed or something, or did the officers and hierarchy of the company, I guess, just decide that they wanted to merge it?
I think it was partly brought on by this man named Poole who brought that suit. And part of it was also, and I really don't know the exact figures out about it. I mean, the exact law, I don't remember or don't understand that, I guess. I don't remember it. But Texas A&M was a land-grant university. It received federal funds, and so I suspect that there was some connection between the fact of if you're receiving federal funds, then you've got to, legally abide by these regulations.
So they were pushed into it because of this Poole case thing, but they were also they kind of had to because of the laws that were passed.
The laws and just the flavor, the society was changing across the country, across the world. Across the United States, would say the wind was blowing in that direction. So there was upheaval and change. Music made a difference during that time. The arts supported those efforts.
So there was almost a sort of peer pressure coming from the other states and the other cities around the place he worked that kind of brought in the changes that happened.
It did, and I think at that time too there were probably at the upper level of the administrative people especially, there were people who came to Texas to work to some of those new positions, and they brought with them ideas from Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and areas that were doing and seeing things in a different kind of a way. So, as you moved into the 70s and 80s, people traveled more, they knew more. All of the may not really be pertinent to what you're talking about, but when you think about what happened to transportation during that time, the interstate highways were established, air travel became quite much more, or it was done a lot more easier, available. So all of those changes affected how agencies and groups of people worked and studied.
You talked about airfare and air travel and how it became more popular. Did once these new, more advanced, more technological things became available, had the discrimination against the black people and the women kind of subsided, and were they now allowed the same opportunities to ride the new airplanes and see the new sights and do the new things that were kind of happening?
Then it became an economic thing, very much an economic thing. So there were always people left behind, and we think of it being as the minorities, but there's a cross-section of, poor people. And we never, in any of that time, or there was very little attention given to Hispanics and what was happening in their communities and to their families. That's another issue, I guess, for another day.
That is another issue. Wow. So, once the things sort of started changing and women started getting better treatment and better job opportunities, they started being able to wear pants, and the black people started working with the white people. Were there any modern changes or people who wanted to stop this that you knew of, either in your community or that you saw on the news or in reading the newspaper?
Nothing overt, but obviously among, the older people, there was a lot of resistance. They just didn't want to accept it because those were just it's the way they were, and that was hard. So we had to retire a generation of people because I worked with a guy who was very racist. There's no question about it. You know, he was just. But in a sense, I do understand why he was that way. We are, you know, a reflection of the families and the communities in the states that we grew up with at that time, and that's why he was that way. I didn't like it. I didn't approve of it. I didn't
Agree with it?
didn't agree with it. Didn't support his efforts, but neither did I.
Stand out against them?
No, never spoke out against it. Probably should have.
Looking back, do you remember any... Obviously, as you've explained, there weren't very many big issues with the way black people and women were treated. But do you...
In Texas, in the communities that I lived in at that time, there were issues in other parts of the country.
Yeah. But do you remember, like looking back, like for the Poole case, and when people were, like, this guy you were talking about who worked with you, do you regret not doing more, not taking more opportunities you could have done to, like, speak out against it?
I guess I was also a little protective of my job and my position. I had to work. It was important that I do that. And so there's always that, that's where a little bit of fear comes in. If I say too much to too many people, I'm never going to get any kind of a salary increase or an advancement in positions. I might even lose my job. So that's a real thing. It happened to the white people and everybody else too.
In your workplace, like, were there any people who were sort of higher on the social ladder, like your bosses and their bosses and bosses higher than that? Were any of them, like, pressuring you and your peers to not speak out specifically and threatening you?
No.
So you say that you were scared to lose your job, but there wasn't anything like they specifically said they would fire you if you spoke out?
Right. But I knew that it could happen. You just knew that.
So, I believe early...
Because you saw it happen to other people.
Did you have any peers in your workplace, or was it, like, in other places in your community?
No, there were a couple of people in my office at one time that were very well qualified and should have had some of the promotions, and because they were black, they were passed over. And that position was given to some white guy. Or later, even in the same thing with women's, there were, but those kind of things I think happened in a lot of agencies and organizations. And so that's something that a country and a community and even a family, you just have to work through and know that change is not easy. And change is not always fair. And change and institutions are slow to change. And there's a risk. I think you can put a lot of emphasis on the risk involved to the people that did. Certainly when we look at the civil rights movements that attracted that major attention, the things that we've seen over the last few weeks that have been brought back to us about Selma, for example, those people took a great risk. And I guess that many of the people that I worked with, and myself included, were not those kind of risk takers. And because the threat was not that great, again, here in our little area in Texas, we didn't talk anything about churches. Much of the leadership came from churches, and they're some of the last, even today, to be integrated. especially the black churches are not very integrated. And I guess it's something that's another subject for another day also.
So in talking about risks, kind of to bring it back to your personal life, you're obviously my grandmother, so you had a daughter and you had a husband. Like, were you worried about having a kid or worried about getting married specifically because there were certain things that it would affect your job or in any way?
Well, because of my husband's position in the business community, I was not really in a position to aspire to become a district director and move to College Station or to another area of the state, because if I had taken an advancement to a district position, it would have meant I would have had to move to a different area. And, my commitment was to my husband and to my family. And so I chose to say, I'm just going to continue to work where I liked my job. I felt like I was making a contribution to my community. So I guess I limited myself in that instance. If I had been ambitious and wanted to go, and some women were, and if they were single or divorced, then they had the freedom or chose to do that, or if they had husbands whose businesses or jobs were not very successful, then there were cases in which the wives moved and the husbands moved with them. That happened less often, but it did, and that was just a family's choice that they made. My choice was to stay in the community and become a part of that stability.
So you say you made this choice specifically yourself, but then you said that some women made the choice to move and they had the freedom to do so. Were there any restrictions on you that, because of getting married and having my mom, that kind of influenced your decision, or maybe even didn't influence your decision? They just happened to be there?
No, I just knew I was going to stay and work at this. I guess one thing we didn't talk about was that one of the changes, though, that happened in addition to the pantsuits things was that at that point, or at that time in the 60s, when women they could be married, but when they became pregnant, they had to quit. You could not work if you were pregnant. So when you were about, 5 or 6 months pregnant, you had to quit. And I actually did. I had to. But see, this was the beginning of some change, too. So I actually quit my job, resigned officially, when I was about 6 months pregnant. But I had a wonderful district agent who, I guess, liked me, and I was doing a good job. So she just held that position open. She never filled that position for 6 months, and in 6 months she hired me back. That was a risk I took. She could have hired somebody else in that position and my job would be gone. I may or may not ever get it back again, because we're not that many positions in Dallas.
Were there other workplaces in your community and in in the cities around you that you knew of, that women were they were just kicked out because they were in your same position of being pregnant?
Well, you just knew that if you were pregnant, you had to submit your resignation. I don't think they ever fired anybody, but I guess they could quit sending you a payroll check, or maybe they send you a desist letter or something. Again, we just knew that was the rules, and we abided by them.
And nobody really spoke out against it?
Not at that point in 1968, no. That, I think, women in Washington and on the national scene made those things happen in Texas, in my situation, I benefited for what my sisters did in other states, and I thank them for it. But I did not do anything. No. I guess I was a wimp.
Well, it was great having you talk about your experiences with the social injustice in your time. Thank you very much for spending the time to talk with me
Well,
about
I've
this.
enjoyed reflecting and doing it with a granddaughter is a special time, and I'm sure I'll have some other thoughts. Perhaps I'll share them in a written or some other form with you.
All right.
I've had a good life, and I've enjoyed it. I have very few regrets.
All right.
I
Great.
appreciate all of the things that other people did before me and during that time that I benefited from.
Okay. I'm glad you've enjoyed this. It was a nice talk.